Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Chatham House webinar, North Korea-Russia Security Cooperation, a marriage of convenience or a strategic alliance. I'm William Matthews, and I'm Senior Research Fellow for China and the World on the Asia-Pacific Programme at Chatham House. Now, Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine has become an increasingly global one in its implications, and one of the most significant developments has arguably been the revival of Russia's partnership with North Korea, its former Cold War ally. That relationship has intensified in recent months from one of North Korean provision of millions of rounds of artillery and missiles to one formalized by a comprehensive partnership treaty to one that now involves the direct deployment of North Korean troops. This raises a host of questions of international importance, including both on the Korean Peninsula and in Europe, and it comes at a time of major global change. There's the ongoing question of the role of China, North Korea's longtime economic lifeline and strategic partner of Russia. There's also the question of how the US might respond to the Russia-North Korea partnership under a second Trump presidency. But perhaps most importantly, especially given the events this week, with South Korean President Yoon's imposition and then repealing of martial law and the political crisis that this has caused, the question of how South Korea should respond to the Russia-North Korea partnership. Our webinar today launches a new Chatham House publication addressing these issues by Dr. Edward Howell, Korea Foundation Fellow on the Asia-Pacific Programme. This paper, supported by the Korea Foundation, is entitled North Korea and Russia's Dangerous Partnership, the Threat to Global Security from the Kim-Putin Axis and How to Respond. And it's available to download from the Chatham House website, and the link will be shared in the chat. Now, in addition to being Korea Foundation Fellow, Edward is a lecturer in politics at the University of Oxford, where he focuses on the international relations, security, and politics of the Korean Peninsula. I'm pleased to say that he's joined today by two other expert panelists. We have Alistair Morgan, CMG, who was the British ambassador to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea from 2015 to 2018. And we have Dr. Gina Kim, Dean of the Language and Diplomacy Division at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. This event is on the record and it is being recorded. I'm going to start off by asking the panelists some initial questions, and in the second half, we'll move on to questions from the audience. For those of you watching, please submit questions throughout the event via the Zoom Q&A function. Please don't use the chat function or the raise hand function because those won't be seen. Use the Q&A function, and do give us your name and affiliation when you submit your questions. But let's jump straight in. So we'll kick things off with a question for each of our panelists, starting with Edward as author of this new paper. So, Edward, in your paper, you characterize the Russia-North Korea relationship as a threat to global security. So, to start us off, perhaps you could tell us a bit about why you see that global security element as a key dimension to analyze. What was it that led you to focus on that scope in looking at this challenge and how the rest of the world should respond?
Thank you very much, William, and good morning and good evening to those of you attending. I think for me, what led me to think about the relationship between North Korea and Russia in global terms was first and foremost North Korea's engagement with the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war, in my view, has shown very clearly how a conflict in Europe in the present day is very much not limited to the European theatre. As North Korea has got more involved through sending artillery, ballistic missiles, now even tens of thousands of troops, the ramifications on global security, I think, are becoming much more evident. I think what we have seen over the past year, which is the focus of my paper, is that the relationship between North Korea and Russia has gone beyond merely a form of transactionalism, a cash for weapons exchange, a cash for artillery exchange, to something more. And it was that something more that prompted me to investigate this further, and particularly in considering the broader dimensions here. This is not just about Moscow and Pyongyang. We obviously have Beijing, which has hitherto taken a rather cautious approach towards saying anything in public about this relationship. We also have the challenges posed to Seoul, to Tokyo, to Washington, and the bilateral and trilateral relationships between these latter three actors. And I think it's important to be clear that now, at a stage when North Korean troops are being sent to the Kursk region, that actually North Korea is now a full-fledged participant in the Ukraine war. It's not just a peripheral observer. And I think that, to me, highlights the interconnectedness between regions and the truly global nature of this war, and therefore the ramifications not just for East Asia as a region or Europe as a region, but for global security more broadly.
Thank you, Edward. Now, a few sort of key issues raised there, one of which obviously is that question of the the response of Beijing to this partnership. So, Alistair, I wonder if we could turn to you now for some thoughts on that, because more while Pyongyang and Moscow were close partners in the Cold War, more recently it has been China that has been seen as North Korea's kind of key ally and economic lifeline. And this intensifying partnership between Kim and Putin is undoubtedly of some concern to Beijing. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how Pyongyang views Russia and China, particularly in light of this partnership. Is there a longer term strategy here to maybe gain leverage against Beijing through a partnership with Russia?
Well, William, thank you very much. And thanks to Edward for his paper and for that introduction. And I hope that in responding to you, William, now I won't lose the focus on the broader geopolitics that Edward raised. I do think it is worth going back, as you did, to look to the Cold War. And of course, during the Cold War, even after the Sino-Soviet split, the DPRK had close relations not just with the Soviet Union, but also with the PRC. And during that time, it tried very hard not to align itself with one in a way that would alienate the other, but actually to leverage its relations with both to secure the greatest advantage for itself during that period. And I think you're seeing some of that again now in the way North Korea, Kim Jong-un turned between China and Russia. I mean, I think a key element of the comprehensive strategic partnership that you referred to that was signed in June with Russia was the revival of the alliance, the revival of the mutual defense treaty between the DPRK and Russia. And I'm sure that's not intended to displace the treaty with China, which has continued uninterrupted or been renewed since 1961, but to complement it. You're right that in many ways the key partner for the DPRK in recent times has been China. But I think it's also worth saying that the relationship between Kim Jong-un's DPRK and Xi Jinping's China didn't really warm up until 2018. And indeed, in 2017, the DPRK was very critical of China, it was critical of Russia too, but directed its most of its criticism publicly against China for not honoring the revolutionary history they had together, the common stance they had against imperialist hegemony. And I think that this is really part of how they do see things. And much of the language that is now being applied by the DPRK to Russia in terms of a relationship forged in blood, comrades in arms, is actually language that has been used in relation to China until quite recently. I think, though, that at the moment, Kim Jong-un does see an opportunity from the Ukraine war for forging a relationship with Russia that it probably could not forge entirely in the same way with China, particularly in terms of potentially the transfer of military technology. And that does run risks of irritating China. China will want to retain its leverage and influence within the peninsula, but I don't believe that it's intended to alienate China. I'm sure that the DPRK wants China and Russia to continue to work together in the United Nations to safeguard the DPRK's interests. And I don't think there's any reason to assume that they will stop doing so. Economically, the DPRK has become very reliant on China. That is partly a consequence of sanctions, which has closed down other markets for the DPRK. And I think there is every reason why it should want to diversify. The final point I'd just make is that while the DPRK at the moment says nothing to cast doubt on its support for Russia in Ukraine or the nature of the alliance, until quite recently, there have been statements by the DPRK casting doubt on reliance on any large partner, including on Russia in relation to defense. And I don't suppose those reservations have gone away completely. So I think that the DPRK will continue to hedge its bets to some extent.
Thank you, Alistair. Now, obviously, there's sort of a lot there in relation to sort of the partnership in Ukraine, but also, the other side of this is, of course, how this relationship affects the Korean Peninsula. So, Gina, if I can turn to you now, I mean, South Korea not only has the fraught relationship that it does with North Korea, but also has relationships with Russia and also China. But what do you see as a likely response from South Korea going forward to the Russia-North Korea partnership? And in particular, I think we can't avoid sort of addressing the question of what we have seen this week in terms of South Korean political developments. Do you think that disruption to South Korean politics is likely to affect how South Korea responds to North Korea-Russia cooperation, and particularly in terms of maybe the sort of cautiousness or assertiveness that response takes?
Right. Thank you for the question. I must say that an investigation into the recent incident is currently underway, and it has been revealed that the President Yoon decided to declare martial law despite oppositions from cabinet members. So reports indicate that the President held the responsibility of all the decision. So concerns about the abuse of martial law by the president have intensified because of this finding. There are still lingering fears that such actions could pose a serious threat to South Korea's democracy. But I must also say that the fact that the issue was resolved through the democratic process, that actually demonstrates the resilience of South Korea's democracy. So I hope things will get to normal soon. The National Assembly swiftly made a decision to revoke the martial law, and both progressive and conservative lawmakers agree that martial law should not be exploited for political purpose. But oppositions are divided on opinions are divided on whether the president should step down for his wrongful decision. An impeachment of the president requires actually 2/3 majority in the National Assembly. That means there should be a support from the ruling party, PPP, to meet this requirement. So it remains uncertain whether the opposition party can gather the necessary numbers. So until then, we still have the same government with the same leadership. So anyway, the president's domestic and international reputation has already been tarnished, and well, disruptions to his foreign activities and policy initiatives are much anticipated. And actually, several bilateral meetings with major countries, including the US, and dialogues with NATO member states have already been canceled, causing some scheduling setbacks. And this situation is expected to negatively impact somehow South Korea's diplomatic endeavors. And regarding South Korea's position on its support to Ukraine, as you know, while the South Korean government has continued to expand its support to Ukraine, it has limited such support to non-lethal military supplies and humanitarian aid. And at the UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's illegal actions, and it talks about promises of support from numerous nations that have been adopted, but these measures are unlikely to fundamentally alter the obligation of non-participating countries of the war to comply with principles of neutrality. And according to South Korea's constitution, international conventions have the same legal effect as domestic laws. So, and also the current Defense Acquisition Program Act stipulates very, very strict regulations on arms export of South Korea. In Russia has warned that any possession of any provision of legal weapons by South Korea to Ukraine would completely damage bilateral relations, and that would respond with all necessary measures. That was the message from Moscow. So any legislative amendments to allow exceptions of the South Korean law must go through parliamentary approval and requiring a relevant committee to deliberate and pass to the plenary session for approval. So all these measures are very, very much complicated. And during this process, the National Assembly should consider all the security and diplomatic friction as well. So the South Korean government has carefully considered its relations with Russia, determining the scope and manner of support very cautiously. And South Korea is likely to continue its support for Ukraine in this manner. And considering potential retaliatory measures, especially against South Korean business operating in Moscow, and the prospect of improving relations with Russia after the Ukraine war, these are also policy considerations as well. But this does not mean that South Korea does not share deep concerns over the potential impacts of North Korea's support for Russia's military activities on global security and the non-proliferation regime, etc. It is deeply concerned about the possibility that military cooperation between the two sides could escalate into a broader global threat. And at the G7 meeting, South Korea's contribution to the support to Ukraine was also discussed. And at that time, South Korea and the G7 countries addressed this issue altogether. So I wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gina. That was a very comprehensive and detailed answer. Now, just on this question of sort of South Korean support for Ukraine, Edward, that's something that you address in the paper, particularly in the part where you're talking about how other countries should respond, and it's a key dimension of what you're talking about there. So I wonder if, and based on some of what Gina has said here about the difficulties of kind of increasing that level of support, do you think that there are credible pathways for South Korea to do that? And what do you consider to be a likely response, Edward, from the North to anything that they might perceive as an escalation, including on the Korean Peninsula as well as in Ukraine?
Thank you, and thank you, Gina, for the very comprehensive remarks. I think that we must remember that North Korea's worldview towards the United States, towards its allies, namely South Korea, is very much rooted in this idea of a hostile policy. Pyongyang has, for years, for decades, even before North Korea acquired nuclear weapons, fundamentally believed that the United States and its allies, what it calls its puppet state of South Korea, will fundamentally never be nice to it. And I think that that is a very important starting point, because what we have seen over the past year is that as South Korea has strengthened its relationship with the United States, as South Korea has strengthened its relationship with Japan and also trilaterally, North Korea's response has been arguably rather expected, criticizing these relationships as part of a desire for regime change, for instance. That's a common criticism from North Korea. But also we have seen North Korea strengthen and heighten its provocations towards South Korea. We've seen artillery fire targeted at the de facto maritime border between the two Koreas, the Northern Limit Line, earlier this year. And we've seen, most obviously, ongoing deployments of refuse-filled balloons from North Korea into South Korea. Again, a comparably low-level provocation, one might say, but it's still an important provocation in and of itself, okay, and could lead to further belligerence. This obviously places South Korea in a very difficult position, because any response taken by Seoul, not least with the assistance of Washington or Tokyo, will be viewed by Pyongyang as a provocation against which North Korea will claim that it has a right to respond. But I think one of the reasons why South Korea needs to continue considering different pathways to respond to the North Korea-Russia relationship is because numerous red lines have been crossed. And the South Korean government has made clear that red lines have been crossed, such as on the 19th of June, when the partnership treaty between Kim Jong-un and Putin was signed, for instance, when the sending of North Korean troops to Russia was not just speculation, but became a clear reality. And I think if we just go back to a statement made by the Russian defense minister, who visited North Korea last week, he said quite clearly that the treaty that was signed on the 19th of June intended to play a stabilizing role in Northeast Asia. That's what he said, and lay the groundwork for a new Eurasian security system. And I think that those words are quite telling as to just how embedded the relationship between Russia and North Korea has become. And this is from the Russian side, okay? So this really does place South Korea in a situation where it needs to consider how best to work with its allies and how to respond, whether that is in a way that leads to the deployment of lethal assistance, as Gina has mentioned, and there are many hurdles, particularly in terms of domestic law, that must be overcome for this, or in other ways as well.
Thank you, Edward. Now, if I could just sort of push you on a couple of points there, and also, I mean, Alistair and Gina, do jump in if you have some thoughts, but particularly in light of that sort of those Russian statements about the stability of Northeast Asia and so on, and these provocations from North Korea. One of the things that you note in the paper is that Kim Jong-un no longer prioritizes reunification of the Korean Peninsula. He sees, as you say, South Korea as a foe. But what then is Pyongyang's strategic objective in relation to South Korea? Does it have a long-term strategic objective beyond just continuous pressure? And how does Russia fit into that?
Thank you. I think if you read the statement that Kim Jong-un made when he led to this change when he outlined this change in policy, ruling out reunification, which is a clear contrast to the rule of his father and his grandfather, the wording was very clear. He talked about the possibility of absorbing South Korea. He talked about the possibility of reclaiming, and the word reclaiming is very important here. South Korean territory. Okay, one cannot reclaim something that wasn't yours in the first instance. And I think that now that North Korea has abandoned reunification as a goal, and we've seen evidence of this, the destruction of infrastructure between the two Koreas, for instance, okay, as just one of many examples. I still think that ultimately Kim Jong-un's view is at some point to prevent or block South Korea's alliance with the United States. This has been a long-standing feature of North Korea's strategy. Longer term, I think North Korea's ultimate goal is to gain international recognition as a de facto nuclear armed state. And this goal underpins very much a lot, if not all, of Pyongyang's strategies towards the US and towards South Korea. It wants this recognition as a nuclear armed state. Why do I say this? Well, even if we look at the announcement yesterday by the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who said pretty clearly that Russia has been assisting North Korea's nuclear program. This again fits in with North Korea's broader, longer-term strategic objective of recognition as a nuclear armed state.
Thank you, Edward. No, that's sort of really helpful, I think, in clarifying some of those priorities from Pyongyang. But I mean, Alistair, you've had some sort of direct experience of sort of North Korean, strategy and so on. Do you have any thoughts on sort of how Pyongyang might see the potential role for Russia in relation to those objectives vis-a-vis South Korea and the South Korea-US alliance?
Well, I agree with what Edward has said, and I think that it is part of the North Korean objective to see a change in the world order. It's already seen a movement away from a unipolar US dominance, but it wishes to undermine US alliances and US hegemony. And within that, at the moment, it sees Russia as the key militant partner with whom it can ally. In terms of the views of North Korea towards South Korea, North Korea has not abandoned absorption or the possibility of conflict. I think for now, its intention is to ensure that it has the greatest possible defense to resist overthrow and to ensure the continuation of North Korea as a viable regime in its current form, and with recognition of nuclear status that Edward referred to. In the longer term, there are clearly risks that go beyond that on the Korean Peninsula. I think the risk from participation by the DPRK in the Ukrainian war, the Russian war in Ukraine, as far as South Korea is concerned, comes mainly from the support that the DPRK gets for its programs, but also if the DPRK believes that this is an instance where the lack of respect for a border and the invasion of a sovereign state, which they wouldn't necessarily recognize in relation to the ROK, is successful, then that will be possibly encouragement to them, though I don't anticipate DPRK military action if it can avoid it for the time being. in the peninsula.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Now we are at sort of the halfway point in the webinar, and we have got quite a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So thank you very much, and do keep submitting questions. We'll try and get through as many as possible. But I thought we might start with one from Rafael Moretto, who's a researcher with RUSI, and he asks about the potential for a diplomatic or even military role for NATO and other allied nations, both in Europe and in Northeast Asia, in responding to the Russia-North Korea partnership. So Gina, I wonder if I can turn to you for some thoughts on that, particularly in relation to sort of how welcome such engagement might be from the perspective of South Korea and potentially Japan and other NATO partner countries in Northeast Asia.
Yeah, of course. I think it is very much desirable to explore multifaceted approaches to address the challenges arising from Russia-DPRK military cooperation. These approaches will include diplomatic efforts, international condemnation, and the strengthening of information sharing to safeguard regional and global security. And coordinated diplomatic pressure, first and foremost, such as issuing joint statements condemning military cooperation between the two sides, must persist to underscore the importance of adherence to international norms and maintaining global momentum to diplomatically isolate North Korea and Russia through a broad coalition opposed to their military ties is very much crucial. And more concrete measures that can be pursued may include non-proliferation actions through export controls. Individuals or multilateral sanctions can be imposed on organizations and individuals involved in Russia, North Korea military cooperation. And these would involve promoting information sharing among like-minded countries to monitor weapons shipments and financial flows between the two sides. And multilateral cooperation will also be crucial in imposing trade penalties on companies or others supporting military cooperation, particularly targeting dual-use technology and logistics firms. And restricting financial networks is also important. Global banks should be engaged to block transactions that facilitate Russia-DPRK cooperation. And also maritime security-related measures, such as imposing restrictions on ports or ship registrations that support the transportation of North Korean weapons to Russia, are also important. And in the context of counter-proliferation, which is more military measures, to my mind, should continue. It should be discussed among various actors on the global stage to strengthen multilateral cooperation to track and intercept illegal arms transfer through maritime routes among like-minded countries. That's some of the suggestions that I would like to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Just on one of the points you made there about sort of increasing diplomatic isolation, there's a measure there. Now, I mean, Russia to a lesser extent, but North Korea particularly, is already very diplomatically isolated. So I wonder if I could just push you a bit on sort of what that actually looks like, and particularly given that we do have the question we've already sort of discussed about the role of China here. Some people also talk about an emerging axis between Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran. Is there a risk that there's now just a growing number of states that are not so interested in isolating Russia and North Korea in this way? And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, or if Edward or Alistair want to jump in on that as well.
Sure. China's role is very, very, very important here. But well, to to what extent we can expect China to contribute diplomatic isolation of these two countries, well, may be questionable, because China has consistently framed deepening ties between Pyongyang and Moscow as matters concerning two sovereign nations, so distancing itself from direct involvement. And China has been refraining from direct commentary or intervention in the bilateral relations. But on the issue of regional stability, I believe there is a shared understanding between China and the US and US allies, including South Korea. But the problem is how to achieve stability in this region is still a contending issue. And well, in general, South Korea's negative sentiment toward China is intensifying due to various factors. And domestically, we have some debates about the positive role of China. On the one hand, the Democratic Party recognizes that China is very crucial in terms of its leverage over Russia and the DPRK. So China can contribute to stability on the Korean Peninsula and beyond in light of resolving regional threats. On the other hand, the conservative parties highlight that China has traditionally favored maintaining the status quo in this region. And these people do not trust China's role in resolving the North Korean nuclear issue, for example. So we have lots of debates, actually. So perhaps those who have more leverage in China may exert some influence to change the course and change the calculation of the leadership in China, I think.
Thank you. Actually, Edward, I wonder if, Edward, if you could sort of provide some further comments here, because we've got actually quite a good question from the audience here that sort of serves as a follow-up to that. And this is a question from Daria Bogolyubova, who's a student at Lancaster University. And she comments that we have seen China prioritize stability, as Gina has just been talking about, and prioritize it over denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. But is there a potential for the North Korea-Russia relationship to pose a threat to stability on the peninsula that could lead to Chinese diplomatic or she asks even physical intervention in opposition to that relationship in order to preserve stability?
Thank you. And I agree with Gina's point, particularly about the domestic politics of South Korea. That's important to consider here. I think in relationship to China, China has been and remains a key enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. China and Russia continue to engage in the trade of dual-use technologies at the same time as North Korea and Russia's relationship has developed. So I think on the one hand, China clearly cannot be too irritated, too upset, for lack of a better word, given the fact that it continues to enable Russia's ongoing war. We know that China and Russia, weeks before the initial invasion in February 2022, signed a no-limits partnership. Okay, Xi Jinping met Putin and agreed on this no-limits relationship. Okay, so even as the relationship between North Korea and Russia has developed, and which may make China feel rather uneasy, I don't think China is willing to let go just yet. Okay, China's cautious stance towards giving its public its viewpoint on the North Korea-Russia relationship publicly, I think epitomizes that it's in a bit of a dilemma. But I think that China's main policy priority is stability. So long as there is stability on the Korean Peninsula, China will be very reluctant to get involved. We know that China does not like having a nuclear neighbor. China does not like having a nuclear North Korea, but it's better than the alternative, which can involve some kind of conflict, some kind of possibility for a stronger US ROK presence on the entirety of the peninsula, and China obviously does not want that. Now, if things were to get to worsen considerably, would China get involved? Perhaps. But I think that we need to be clear that at the moment, the fact that China is taking a step back does highlight that, in a way, perhaps China can also benefit in so doing, because Russia can be the bad cop and China can be the good cop. China cares more about its international status than Russia and North Korea at the moment. China does not have to get involved in supplying financial assistance, food assistance, the unknown realm of military technology. That's the big unknown to North Korea now.
Yes,
If I
and that,
could-
I mean, that point about I think sort of China's desire to be seen as a sort of as a more responsible international actor is quite significant. And speaking, if we may, about more or less responsible international actors, we have a couple of questions from the audience from both Alistair Moore and Luca Badaclini about Donald Trump as US president and how that might affect some of the issues. So Luca asks, how might the new US administration's foreign policy reshuffle the cards in the relationship between North Korea and the key other powers involved in the the Northwest Pacific, particularly Russia and China and Japan and South Korea. And then Alistair asks, how might Trump's stance on Kim Jong-un be affected by the development of the Moscow-Pyongyang partnership? Now, these are big questions, but I wonder, Alistair, if we can turn to you for some initial thoughts on that.
Yes, if I could just link that back to the question about isolation, because of course President Trump in his first term pursued a policy of engagement in the second part of his first term with Kim Jong-un. Diplomatic isolation is not just something that is imposed. It's a question of the way the state reacts as well. And it wasn't by choice that the Biden administration has had no high-level engagement with North Korea. It's because North Korea has chosen not to have that engagement. And Kim Jong-un has said, as Edward has already alluded to, really, that North Korea doesn't see the hostile policy changing towards the DPRK, and that its experience of engaging with Trump first time round showed that it was deep-grained rather than otherwise. There are many ways in which a Trump presidency could change the dynamics. A somewhat different stance towards Russia, a commitment to engaging on ending the war in Ukraine, a hardline policy towards China, but which is particularly economically hardline, a relationship with allies in the region, which may call into question exercising, may call into question the stationing of US troops overseas, will probably expect allies across the world to increase their defense expenditure. There are many ways in which that could play out, and I think the fact that there is such a focus on China means that some of the things that Japan and the Republic of Korea wish to do and need to do in relation to the DPRK, actually they're going to be doing anyway in terms of maintaining defense expenditure. But I'll stop there because I can't tell you how to resolve the issue of nuclear North Korea. And I don't foresee the relationship with Russia coming to an end.
Thank you, Alistair. Gina, do you have some thoughts you'd like to add in there?
Yeah, actually, well, Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee once emphasized that cooperation with Russia could serve as a strategic element to counter the trilateral alliance of the US, South Korea, and Japan. And earlier this year, Chairman Kim also mentioned that North Korea's pursuit of a new international order, and he also mentioned international justice, in order to emphasize that cooperation with Russia plays a very, very central role in North Korea's foreign policy. Considering all these comments, North Korea is certainly emphasizing its value to Russia. But what will happen after President Trump takes the office? Well, it is my expectation that he is going to resolve all the regional conflicts so that he can focus more on China. Then we can expect conclusion of the conflict in Ukraine, which will lead to reassessment of North Korea's importance. If post-war Russia seeks to ease tensions with the US and its allies, including South Korea, North Korea's significance may further diminish, in my opinion. And North Korea-Russia cooperation has predominantly focused on social and economic sectors so far, as evidenced by high-level meetings and personal exchanges, rather than military collaboration, which came very, very important recently. Anyway, enhancing North Korea's unchecked military capabilities does not align with Russia's national interest. And these may suggest inherent limitations in the extent of military technological support to Pyongyang. And aligning with a nation like North Korea, which is called as a pariah state, by the way, carries reputational cost. In scenarios where Russia faces diplomatic isolation similar to North Korea's, concerns about reputational cost may not be that great. However, if situation changes and circumstances evolve, the calculation of a cost and benefit for Russia is likely to change accordingly. That's something that we need to consider in the long term.
Thank you for that, Gina. And that question of, a potential sort of post-Ukraine war situation and what that might imply for the Russian-North Korean relationship, I think is a very interesting and pertinent one. And just on that, again, a couple more questions we've got coming in. And Edward, I wonder if you'd like to respond to these. So we've got two questions here. One from Hakan Babur, who asks about any prospect for Russia and North Korean cooperation on Russian interests in the Caucasus, and another from Christina De Corsi at Nazarbayev University in Astana, who asks that if a settlement for the Ukraine war does go in Russia's favor, might Putin decide to target Central Asia or elsewhere in Europe, Central Asia particularly being of significance due to mineral resources and also long-standing Russian geopolitical influence there? Are these areas where North Korea might also play a role post-war?
Thank you. I think both of these questions, the answer to both of them, we just do not know. I think I'm just going to outline a couple of points. I think firstly, the North Korea-Russia relationship, even the more recent military cooperation, as Gina has mentioned, has been very much tied between North Korea and Russia. It's very much North Korea providing artillery, providing ballistic missiles, now sending troops, the latter which to me is a sign that Pyongyang has decided to make clear its commitment to Russia's war against Ukraine and in return get something that it values. The possibility of Putin expanding into other regions and other areas in the vicinity, host Ukraine, and North Korea assisting Putin then, I think that is something that really is in the realm of speculation. One of the things that the Ukraine war has taught, or one thinks that the Ukraine war has taught Putin, has been that being an occupying power is costly. That might affect Russian strategy in the future. And I think that at the moment, the deployment of North Korean troops to assist Russia's war effort against Ukraine is very much it's not going to change Putin's overall war strategy. But on the part of Russia, these troops are needed. And my overall view is that, much like what Alistair mentioned earlier, even if the Ukraine war were to end, the relationship between North Korea and Russia is likely to continue, but it will not be the same. I think it will not be the same as it is now, because obviously the need for artillery, for troops, diminishes. I think we are going to see this extension in this relationship more broadly, because particularly given the support that Russia has given North Korea in the UN Security Council, we are now at a stage where the UN Security Council is basically paralyzed and unable to make any form of decision, whether that's passing sanctions resolutions or statements of condemnation, because of Russia's veto power. And that very much sits in line with North Korea's interest. And obviously maintaining its veto power in the Security Council very much sits in line with Russia's interests as well.
So that, I mean, that point, those points I think about, particularly those sort of military questions and the nature of that, and what sort of Russia's discovered about, you know, the nature of being an occupier in power and so on. These are, I think, pertinent points, and we've got a question here actually, which is about sort of, you know, the extent to which North Korea has justified its involvement through the provision of weaponry and the provision of troops now to its own people. And we've got time for a quick answer to this question. Then there's one other question I want to sort of get some brief thoughts on. But Alistair, yeah, this question here from Simon Smith: is there any documented articulation of the DPRK's rationale for joining the war in Ukraine, and how this has been explained for public consumption in North Korea itself?
As far as I know, there isn't an explanation of what the DPRK has done in terms of either supplying munitions or in terms of the deployment of troops. But what it has done is make available the comprehensive strategic partnership and the terms of that, which include basing the defense agreement on Article 51 of the UN treaty. So in international terms, that is what North Korea leans on. I don't know how much people within the DPRK are aware of the actual extent of North Korean munitions trade and supply of troops.
Right, thank you. I mean, and you know, obviously, this is sort of a very difficult question to answer, as are any about sort of some of those internal questions in North Korea. But I wonder if, as a final question from the audience, before we move on to sort of final comments, we can address something a little bit different. This is a question from John Bezic at Chatham House. Now, we've talked a lot so far, as we are kind of disposed to do when we're talking about matters of international relations, about treaties and about events and their implications. But there are also longer term processes at work. And this question from John is about what role, if any, demographics are going to have in the relationships on the Korean Peninsula, and how those might affect some of these broader geopolitical questions. I imagine particularly questions there being about the sort of the disparity in sort of population and wealth and so on between the two countries, but also the long-term question of declining birth rates and what that might mean for some of the regional geopolitics. Now, I realize this is a bit of a left field question, but I wonder if any of you have some thoughts on that that you'd like to introduce. I mean, perhaps thinking particularly about, you know, does, for example, declining birth rate in South Korea pose long-term security challenges, for example, in being able to mount the kind of deterrence and force that would be needed to effectively counter the threat from North Korea and its partners. Gina.
About demographic change, yes, we have a smaller, younger generation, which can have an impact on the size of the troops. However, on the other hand, we are also focusing on modernization of all the weapon system at the same time. And we have a huge army anyway. It has to be streamlined with elite forces. So we are dealing with this issue with a long-term project. The problem here is rather about the political question about the people's support to unification, because we have different generation with different ideas about reunification of the two Koreas. Actually, we had lots of discussions when North Korea suggested a two Korea formula, rejecting reunification between the two Koreas. Well, historically, it has been North Korea that denounced the idea of two Korea formula. So it's, well, in my opinion, its intent to reject reunification can be viewed as a very defensive move as well. North Korea is grappling with economic sanctions and internal challenges. And in this context, it appears to be employing a strategy of emphasizing external enemies like South Korea or the US to strengthen its internal cohesion. And blocking influence on the younger generation in North Korea is another consideration that probably Chairman Kim had in his mind. This could be an effort to prevent culture shift among North Koreans' younger generation. So they have the generation issue as well. The rising admiration for South Korea's culture and dramas and films, that actually could be viewed as a threat to the society. So for the time being, North Korea is emphasizing two Korea narratives and clearly separating itself from South Korea. It is just because of, I think, internal problems, also because of its very good strategic environment as well. North Korea is likely gaining foreign currency and economic support in exchange for providing military supplies to Russia. So in these circumstances, there is little incentives for North Korea to adopt a conciliatory stance or seek aid from South Korea or the US. But when the situation changes, I think North Korea's calculation may change, and we may, have another moment to talk about reunification, well, in the long term. So that's my prediction.
Brilliant. Thank you. Now we are coming up to time, but we have got time for some closing remarks from each of our panelists on to what has been a very wide-ranging and rich and fruitful discussion. So I'll give you each about half a minute to have some closing remarks, and unless you've got any sort of particular point you want to raise, perhaps this can be structured in terms of, we've talked about how the rest of the world should respond. Perhaps you could focus those closing remarks on, one thing that you think could be part of the most effective international response to the ongoing partnership between Russia and North Korea. And Alistair, if I can turn to you first, then Gina, and then give the last word to Edward as order of the paper.
I would like to supplement the answer I gave to Simon Smith's question by just saying that North Korea has made very clear in its media why it believes that the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine is justified. I'd also like to make the point that while North Korea may be transactional or may have been transactional, I think that its transactions actually occur within a strategic framework, that it will only undertake transactions where it thinks that it's not at risk from doing so. Although I'm sitting in Japan, from my perspective as a British national, I think that the most important thing to do is to continue to support Ukraine. And in terms of the Korean Peninsula, I think making sure that dysfunction within governments, financial constraints within governments, the constant need to focus on other issues doesn't actually distract from preparing for a response to North Korea.
Thank you, Alistair. Gina, if you can give maybe a just brief one-sentence final comment, and then we will turn to Edward for a final one-sentence comment, and then we will have to finish.
My basic understanding of the current relations between the DPRK and Russia is opportunistic pragmatism. So it depends on the strategic environment. That's all from me. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gina. And Edward, the last word to you.
North Korea's strategy is underpinned by what I call strategic delinquency. It knows that by behaving badly, it will get benefits. And so this is why I think we must not dismiss the North Korean threat, and we should take it very seriously.
Brilliant. Thank you. And please do join me in thanking each of our panelists, Edward Howell, Alistair Morgan, and Gina Kim, for their excellent contributions today. And thank you again to the Korea Foundation for their support for this research. And as I mentioned, the paper is available to download from our website and the link in the chat, but we will leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for your excellent questions and for participation. Thank you.